Today, we're in the Upper Peninsula and headed up to the highest point in the Wolverine State. Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today we find ourselves in the beautiful Upper Peninsula of Michigan and headed up to the highest point in the state. But before we start this adventure, take a moment and click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Located in the Upper Peninsula near the base of the Keweenaw Peninsula, Mount Arvon is part of the Huron Mountains, the largest mountain chain in Michigan. The Hurons are at their heart ancient peaks, the bedrock being over 1 billion years old. At one point, the peaks here in the Upper Peninsula soared to the heavens, comparable to the Rocky Mountains. Over time, though, water and wind took their toll and wore them down. The mountains, though, didn't make it exactly easy, because they're primarily made up of igneous and metamorphic rocks, mainly granites and gneiss, both highly resistant to erosion. The mountain bedrock is part of the larger Canadian Shield, which in turn is a significant chunk of the Laurentia Craton, the ancient core of the North American continental plate. It encircles the Hudson Bay and stretches down all the way into the Upper Peninsula. One of the more, in a geological sense, recent features that shaped this landscape was the Ice Ages. They repeatedly covered Michigan in a wall of ice well over 1 mile high, the glaciers grinding and shaping the land we see today, one of forests, rivers, and streams. Michigan can primarily be divided up into 2 regions, the more populated Lower Peninsula and the wilder Upper Peninsula. The difference between these 2 parts, though, actually comes from their geological makeup, which has influenced their history and cultural identities. The Lower Peninsula is dominated by the younger Michigan Basin, a low-lying structure formed by sediment deposited by ancient seas over millions of years, and more recently, extensively shaped by glacier and meltwater. In modern times, this area was transformed by agriculture, and almost all Michigan's major cities and population are found here. The UP, on the other hand, is still a remote and lightly populated part of Michigan. Only 3% of the population live up here. Often referred to as Yoopers, they have a proud and strong regional identity. Human settlement in the UP was slow to start, but archaeological finds have identified copper mining sites dating back over 9,000 years. These sites are some of the earliest known metalworking in all of North America. Archaeologists and anthropologists don't exactly have the clearest picture of human history here in the Upper Peninsula, but there's a few things that they're pretty sure of. One, the copper mining here continued on for several thousand years. 2, the pieces manufactured here were valued commodities. And finally, there was a robust trade network, and these pieces have been found throughout the Great Lakes region and even further abroad. Based on petroglyphs that have been discovered, it's believed early woodland tribes were here in the Upper Peninsula dating back a millennia ago. By the 17th century, tribes from the larger Anishinaabe people, also known as the Ojibwe or Chippewa, were thriving here. These were the people the French encountered when they came to this region in pursuit of fur and trade. The French Empire's North American colonial holdings of New France centered their economy around the fur trade and established an extensive trading network down the St. Lawrence River and throughout the Great Lakes region. New France could best be described as a water-facing colony. The lakes, rivers, and seas essential for its ability to get its trade goods into the interior, and then the furs that it received for them back out to Quebec and then shipped to France. French-Canadian voyageurs traveled the waterways in their birch bark canoes, and along with them came missionaries. France required the fur companies to do three things: build the trade, save souls, and establish a military presence. The first mission established in this region was in 1660 by Father Rene Maynard to convert the Anishinaabe people. On a personal note, Father Rene Maynard is suspected of disappearing just a few miles from where I grew up, at a place called the Goodrich Dells on the Rib River. Father Maynard was followed by Father Claude Alloway in 1665, who spent 25 years proselytizing to the native tribes both here and throughout the Great Lakes region. At the same time, the French established a fur trading post here. They named it Lance, meaning the bay. This post would operate throughout the French colonial period and continue to thrive even after France lost control of this territory to Great Britain at the conclusion of the French and Indian War. Despite the French ceding New France to Great Britain, the fur industry continued to thrive. Unlike the French, who were more integrated with the locals, the British were focused on increasing the profitability of the fur trade, often to the detriment of native tribes. One of the British entities operating from here was the famous Hudson Bay Company. At the conclusion of the American Revolution, this territory would be ceded yet again, this time to the newly formed United States, who organized it into the Northwest Territory. Great Britain, though, was slow to relinquish their control of the region, mainly due to the profitability of the fur trade. Both parties would sign the Jay Treaty in 1797, where Britain was officially supposed to leave the area. Unfortunately, they didn't. British fur traders continued to work the region and created unrest with the Native Americans. This, along with many other issues, would lead to the War of 1812. Due to its proximity to British Canada, Michigan became one of the front lines of the war. Early American efforts to use the territory as a springboard to invade British territory turned into disaster, with the British and their native allies eventually capturing Detroit and several other key forts. Eventually, American soldiers were able to regain the lost lands, but it wouldn't be until 1815, after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, when the British finally vacated the Northwest Territory. Even with another change in ownership, fur continued to be one of the main reasons to come here. As late as 1830, John Jacob Astor would establish his American Fur Company on Mackinac Island. In 1820, Lewis Cass, governor of the Michigan Territory, led an expedition up here of explorers, scientists, and soldiers. Their goal was to study the geology and geography of the Upper Peninsula, establish relationships with the Native Americans, find locations for future forts, and see if there were any valuable mineral resources in the region. The expedition traveled up north from Detroit and then along the shores of the Upper Peninsula. They portaged across the Keweenaw Peninsula and stopped here to take in the Ontonagon Rock, a massive chunk of copper. The expedition continued until it reached modern-day Minnesota, where they were unsuccessful in locating the headwaters of the Mississippi River. The Cass expedition was the first major detailed exploration of the Upper Peninsula. It found some key clues that perhaps there was more here than met the eye. How Michigan came to be and why its high point is where it's at is an interesting bit of history in its own right. In 1803, Ohio became a state, and shortly thereafter, Congress moved to reorganize the Northwest Territory. At the time, Michigan was in the newly formed Indiana Territory, a massive chunk of land that stretched all the way up into northern Minnesota. The settlers living in what's now modern-day Michigan weren't too keen on the fact that their territory capital was down in Vincennes, hundreds of miles away, effectively disenfranchising them. They protested, and eventually Congress yielded. The Michigan Territory was established and signed into law by President Thomas Jefferson in 1805. But at that point, it only included the Lower Peninsula and a small section of the Upper Peninsula. The high point for this territory was actually in the Lower Peninsula, but more on that in a bit. It also included, due to how it was written, a section of land in the south that would become a point of conflict for Michigan and Ohio. It became known as the Toledo Strip, and it's why I find myself in Ohio right now, because this 468 square mile block of land is the reason Michigan's high point is where it's at. In the early 1800s, this was prime real estate, perfect for agriculture, which it still is today, and perfect for trade due to the Maumee River granting access to Lake Erie and the interior. The Toledo War, as it has went down in history, came about due to a bad understanding of the Great Lakes. When the Northwest Territory was formed, it was stated it would eventually become no less than 3, but no more than 5, future states. One of the boundaries laid out for this was an east and west line drawn through the southerly bend, or extreme, of Lake Michigan. So that seems straightforward enough, but if you took the map they were using and compared it to a modern map, you'll quickly notice something is wrong, and mainly that the southern point of Lake Michigan was a lot further south than they realized. And it's this discrepancy between what they thought and what was real that led to the contested land. This border dispute would all come to a head in 1830 when Michigan applied for statehood. Both sides passed laws, took legal action, and commissioned new surveys, each supporting their respective position. Michigan set out settling the area, collecting taxes, and even sent the militia to seize control of Toledo. Ohio, in turn, blocked Michigan's petition for statehood in Congress. Neither Michigan nor Ohio had any intention of backing down from their respective position, and as tensions ratcheted up between the two, they soon both called out their militias to march on and seize the Strip. The closest things ever got to a full-blown conflict was here at Phillips Corners. On April 26, 1835, a Ohio survey party was fired on by the Michigan militia. Fortunately, nobody was injured in the fracas, though several people were arrested later. As the crisis was moving towards a full-blown conflict, President Andrew Jackson got involved. He made a very calculated political move, supporting Ohio. After all, Ohio was already a state, and his Democratic Party needed their support in Congress. A compromise was negotiated. Ohio would receive the Toledo Strip, and Michigan would be granted statehood and receive the UP all the way over to the Montreal and Menominee rivers. When first offered this deal, though, Michigan actually refused, believing the Upper Peninsula to be worthless. Eventually, though, they did agree to the terms, and in January 1837, Michigan became the 26th state. At first glance, well, it looked like Michigan had lost, but it turned out to be quite a different story. The Upper Peninsula was not the sterile wilderness it had been billed as. Quite the contrary, there was real wealth to be had. You just had to dig a little deeper to find it. Traveling from the Lower Peninsula to the Upper Peninsula can almost feel like traveling to a brand new state. The UP is a different type of Michigan with its own history and cultural identity. The transition between these two peninsulas was even more distinct 200 years ago. American geologist Henry Schoolcraft described it like this: "One cannot help fancying that he has gone to the ends of the earth and beyond the boundaries appointed for the residence of man." Separating the lower and upper peninsulas are the Straits of Mackinac, the main strait 3.5 miles wide and 295 feet deep. Joining the two peninsulas is an engineering marvel, the Mackinac Bridge, nicknamed the Mighty Mac. Completed in 1957, this bridge is almost 5 miles long and is the longest suspension bridge between anchorages in the Western Hemisphere, and, despite its age, still the 27th longest main-span bridge in the world. At first, westward expansion in the Upper Peninsula was rather slow. The Ojibwe still controlled a significant part of the region. That said, change was on the horizon. In 1840, David Houghton, the state geologist of Michigan, published a report detailing the copper deposits on the Keweenaw Peninsula. It wasn't long before mining interests, land speculators, and other entrepreneurs were actively lobbying the government to gain access to this land. This area of Michigan was ceded to the United States at the signing of the 1842 Treaty of La Pointe. It was one of the largest cessions of land made between the U.S. government and the native tribes, and opened up the land to mineral and timber exploitation. Mining in the UP really picked up speed in the mid-19th century. The copper deposits in the Keweenaw and the iron deposits around the UP in general meant there were no shortage of mining interest and investors hoping to strike it rich. To reflect the importance and influence of mining, the memorial stone Michigan sent for the Washington Monument weighed over a ton, made up of silver and copper, originating from the Cliff Mine on the Keweenaw Peninsula. Once the mining industry found its footing in the UP, these mines started to churn out vast amounts of wealth. The ore strikes here were more profitable than the California gold rush. By the 1860s, 90% of American copper came from here. By the 1890s, this place was the #1 producer for iron ore in the country. Metal and timber from the Upper Peninsula fueled the Industrial Revolution, taking place in Detroit and across the wider United States. Modern inventions, like electricity and the telephone, required more copper than ever. In turn, miners and loggers flocked to this region. There was an influx of immigrants moving to the UP from Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Germany, Canada, and especially Finland. By the start of the 20th century, around 75% of the population in the Upper Peninsula had been born in a foreign nation. In this part of the UP, though, it wasn't actually copper or iron that spurred an economic boom, but slate. Slate had long been used in human history as a roofing and building material. In the 19th century, it had found its way into public education. Classrooms had their slate blackboards and students their individual slate tablets. By the 1860s, slate was a valued commodity, particularly as the U.S. began expanding. Due to the difficulty in transporting slate over long distances, there was incentive to find local sources. Baraga County may seem remote, but it had two key advantages. One, a deep harbor, and two, access to the trade networks of the Great Lakes. In 1872, when slate was discovered here, a boomtown quickly sprung up. They named it Arvon, after the Welsh region of Carnarvon, an area famous for its slate industry. This isn't actually as peculiar as it sounds, because many of the miners living here were Welsh immigrants. The mountain is thought to have taken its name from the town. At its height, the town of Arvon had a population of 300 people. The quality of the slate here was top-notch and in demand, with lucrative contracts coming in from Chicago, Texas, and other parts of the country. But the boom soon turned to bust. There were big plans, one of them to hook the tramway that connected the slate quarries with the docks down on the bay with the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railway. Unfortunately, they never came to fruition. The Panic of 1893 hit, and the railway went belly up. And an interesting side note, that railway had actually been totally finished. All the track had been run, but the trains never ran. The slate industry in Arvon dried up, and the town was soon abandoned. You can still find the old slate quarries. Several are located near Mount Arvon. They provide an interesting glimpse of a brief time period when this rock was all the rage. Baraga County is named after the Venerable Irenaeus Frederick Baraga, a Slovenian Roman Catholic missionary. He founded a mission in Lance in 1843 to minister to and advocate for the Ojibwe people. Nicknamed the Snowshoe Priest, he traveled hundreds of miles in hard northern winters to tend to his parishioners. While Lance had begun as a fur trading and missionary post, by the 1870s, the arrival of the railroad transformed the town, though plans for expansion were derailed by the Panic of 1873. The hits kept coming. By 1896, Lance was almost completely destroyed by fire. The town rebuilt and transitioned into a logging town. Logging had been a constant presence in the UP since the 1830s, but by the 1880s, it had shifted to an industrial scale. If you were to stand here in the early 1800s, you'd have been witness to a landscape of dense forests of virgin timber that appeared inexhaustible. But that was not to be the case. By the first few decades of the 20th century, almost all the stands of old-growth virgin white pine was gone. Logging in this area continued through the 1920s and 30s with the arrival of one of Michigan's biggest companies, Ford Motors. Ford needed the iron and timber to feed its assembly lines in Detroit, and the UP had both materials and an easy way to transport them via the Great Lakes. We think of cars today mainly as metal and plastic, but early automobiles had quite a bit of wood in them. Production of the ubiquitous Model T required almost 1 million board feet a day. In the years following World War I, Ford Motors built the nearby town of Alberta and its sawmill to meet the demand of its factories. Henry Ford sought to control all aspects of his production, even opening up some of the old slate quarries around Mount Arvon for building materials. Alberta was also built to be a social experiment. This was a model town, and it had the houses, schools, and other necessities for the everyday American worker. The people living here were expected to split their time between lumbering, milling, and farming. And if you pass through Alberta today, you can still see vestiges of this time period. You can't miss the Ford on the lake. For Henry Ford, this area was also an escape. The vagabonds, Ford and his friends, Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, and John Burroughs, spent one of their annual camping adventures up in the UP, passing through Lance in April 1924. It wasn't all rest and relaxation, though. Ford used his trip across the peninsula to scout locations for future facility sites for Ford Motors. Fast forward to today, and the timber industry still plays a key role in the economic growth of this region. Mount Arvon and the surrounding area is owned by the Lime Great Lakes Timberlands, who allow the general public access to the summit. And with that in mind, it's time for us to focus a bit more on Michigan State High Point. If there's a theme around Michigan State High Point, it's probably how frequently it has changed over the course of the last century. But that's not an issue exclusive to just the State High Point, because the Lower Peninsula finds itself with its very own High Point controversy. For many years, the highest point in the Lower Peninsula was thought to be Briar Hill, near the town of Cadillac, with an elevation of 1,706 feet. It also laid claim to the title of Michigan's most prominent peak. Recently, though, a wrench has been thrown into the mix because a new LiDAR survey has determined that perhaps Briar Hill isn't the Lower Peninsula high point, but that it's actually to the southeast, here at Grove Hill. The LiDAR survey measured Grove Hill at 1,709 feet, 3 feet taller than Briar Hill. If this new measurement stands up to scrutiny, then Grove Hill becomes the new highest point in Michigan's Lower Peninsula. Not only that, it will also gain the title of most prominent peak in the Wolverine State, with a prominence of 1,044 feet. Here in the UP, the state high point title has been claimed by 4 different peaks. Originally, the first peak to claim the title was in the Porcupine Mountains, a range that runs along the coast of Lake Superior. The Porkies provided 2 candidates. The first peak, thought to be the Michigan State High Point, was Government Peak, then later Summit Peak until the 1950s. The title shifted to the east after that to Mount Kerwood here in Baraga County at 1,978 feet. It held on to the title until the early 1980s. In 1982, the U.S. Department of Interior's Geological Survey resurveyed this area and discovered that Mount Arvon was actually 11 inches taller than Mount Kerwood. This once overlooked peak was now shoved into the limelight and has held on to the title of Michigan's tallest natural point ever since. Recently, Mount Arvon's title has been challenged, but not by another natural peak, but instead by a giant waste pile. The Tilden Mine is the last large active iron mine in the Upper Peninsula, and now claims the tallest point in Michigan in the form of its man-made tailings pile that rises over 2,000 feet. Fortunately for us high pointers, this is a man-made structure and not the natural high point, so there's no reason to rush over to Ishpeming and try to figure out how to get on top of it. You have a couple options on how to reach the summit here. In the summertime, you can drive or hike up, or you could even take a mountain bike up. In the winter, take a snowmobile, cross-country ski, or even follow in the footsteps of Bishop Baraga and snowshoe to the top. One of the recent additions to this summit is the Mount Arvon hiking trail. It is 1.75 miles from the trailhead to the summit, with a gain of about 425 feet. If you do decide to drive up, you may wish to take a vehicle with a bit of a higher clearance, as the route you're going to be going down can get a bit rugged. The roads you'll be traveling are logging roads, and they can deteriorate a bit in inclement weather. Regardless, you're going to want to start here at Zion Lutheran Church. The entire route to the summit has been included for reference, though of course greatly sped up. The road to the peak is marked with blue signs, with arrows pointing the way. The drive to the top from the church takes about 30 minutes. Once you make it to here, the parking lot, it's only a short walk to the summit. Let's go check it out. The summit area is enclosed and doesn't really afford much of a view, though you can still get a bit of one if you hike down the slope just a bit. And here we are on the summit of Mount Arvon, the rooftop of Michigan. With an elevation of 1,979 feet, this is the 38th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Skye Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment. Click those like and subscribe buttons below, and I'll see you soon.